Then, so let's dig into this subject and my guests on the program. From the Ethiopian capital, we have Zemedene Nigatu, who's the chair of the Fairfax Africa Fund. With me in the studio here in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi, is Kwame Owino, who's the CEO of the Institute of Economic Affairs here in Kenya. My first question is to both of you gentlemen. I'm going to start with you, Kwame, though. What do we need to do to make the CFTA work? It's very ambitious, but it's one thing to have the ambition here, but making it work is a whole different story.
Well, I think that they need a small and smart program. I think they shouldn't go for too much. In my view, one of the things that's very possible to complete very quickly is a customs union, and obviously, a customs union basically. So once you have a customs union, it means that we have common rules for what comes in and what goes out, and just having open the borders. I think a monetary union, in my view, is not just a bad idea. It's going to complicate everything else quite a bit. So if they have that smart program, which is to get us as quickly as is possible to a customs union, agree to the rules and execute it, building from the existing blocks, then that can happen very, very quickly, and that would be extremely valuable.
Right. Zemedene, from your perspective in Ethiopia, what needs to be done in order to make the CFTA work?
Right, so a number of things. Obviously, it's good news that Ethiopia, which is the headquarters of the African Union, was one of the leaders in ratifying the CFTA, so that's a good sign. From not just from the Ethiopian perspective, I would like to speak from a Pan-African perspective. First and foremost, it sounds simple and straightforward, but we need to stay focused. I think it's good news that Africa has come this far in such a relatively short period of time, but there's a lot to be done, as the Commissioner just indicated in his remarks. Something like 90% of it has to be in place in terms of tariffs harmonization. And most importantly, by the way, it's not just the tariffs and other things, but infrastructure has been one of the major impediments for inter-Africa trade not to grow. So I think a focus on that area is also important. But in general, I think there are a number of things, as I said, harmonizations of the trades and tariffs. The tax regimes need to be harmonized, or at least looked at, to make sure that no one country is disadvantaged or one other country has an advantage over others. So the fairness aspects has to be continuously focused on and be demonstrated by actual legislations. And at the end of the day, the things that we need to put together is to make sure that everybody feels that they're in it together and they'll benefit from it. If that happens, I think it took the European Union, 50 years to get to where we are, actually more than 50 years. We shouldn't expect Africa to be there by June 2020, but at least make sure that the initial first steps, the concrete steps, are done to get this launched by June 2020.
Kwame, at the end of the day, though, this really is a political process as well, isn't it? And that's ultimately where this comes down to, where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, because governments will always try and protect what they deem as politically sensitive areas. So along those lines, what are the key risks that you're seeing to implementation by July?
Okay, I think one of those, of course, is that we have interest groups on all sides across every border. And they're definitely interested in actually capturing and maintaining their hold on domestic markets. Even in Kenya, you can see the argument.
Is a prime example of that.
Precisely. So we are arguing here about whether the milk that comes from Uganda, which is cheaper, is necessarily bad for consumers. I think that's definitely going to happen. So we're going to have business lobbies and very powerful lobbies trying to actually to hold barriers to continue to exist. And what that means is necessarily that everybody will try as much as possible to take a defensive attitude, which is not useful. But yes, they have quite some political power.
And fundamentally, it really won't work. Zemedene, Ethiopia is a very interesting case study here, though, because it signed up to a very limited range of trade blocs. I know it's a member of COMESA. It has AGOA access to the United States. It's got an EPU with an EPA with the European Union. So assuming, just for the sake of argument, assuming it eventually does join the WTO or maybe the AAC later on, how would it balance these obligations across these various trade blocs and various trade rules?
Right. Very good point. By the way, you said assuming Ethiopia will join the WTO. I think I want to just give you news here. The government recently has announced that it is joining the WTO, probably in 2020. I think very likely in 2020. So it's no longer an if. As you know, it's probably one of the longest accession processes of any country ever that joined the WTO that Ethiopia has been on. But since the new reforms, the economic reform program was announced, the government made very strong steps to join the WTO. As you also mentioned, Ethiopia is not a member of the East African community. It, for a long time, it shied away from these sort of regional trading blocs. And to be very frank with you, even me, I wasn't quite comfortable that Ethiopia should join these trading blocs, but it really would have been a huge disadvantage. But now that it is becoming one of the major manufacturing export hubs of Africa and exporting to around the world, the next step for Ethiopia would be to join these, these regional trading blocs, WTO, because it will be one of the major beneficiaries, because it will now be exporting to the neighborhood. Today, for example, I'll give you real life examples. I chair a global manufacturing company, a European company that has set up shop. We now export around the world. We have 5,000 stores around the world. We're now exporting to the US, to Europe and all that, but we're not exporting anything to Africa. But through this liberalization, they're opening up the regional trade blocs. Our next focus is going to be right here in the neighborhood, not just the neighborhood, all the way to West Africa. So Ethiopia has decided at the right time to open up and join this trading bloc. So it's the right time. I just wanted to add something earlier, which I failed to do. One of the success for the CFTA to succeed, we can't be having winners or losers, or at least the perception of some countries are winning and others losing. So that is one of the key attributes we have to look for when we measure the success, or not, I don't want to say the failure, but the drag out of the implementation of the CFTA. Everybody has to feel like they're benefiting from it.
Okay, so Kwame, at the end of the day, to come back to that same question, if you're looking at the Kenyan situation, if you're a manufacturer here,
yes,
Ethiopia is coming in from the north, right?
Yes.
They've got their goods coming into this market, but you're a member of the East African community and COMESA. Now you've got an EPA with the EU, and on top of that, you've got the CFTA. There's so many different layers here. How do we balance out the relationship between these trade blocs?
I think that's one of the reasons that the free trade area is obviously an imperative. Because yes, you have too many rules and all of those rules are not necessarily compatible with each other. So if we go through a customs union at the continental level, then obviously it gives us, or rather we'll put onto it the rules that we have already committed to in other places. The most important thing is it's going to create coherence within the African continent. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a good thing. So what we do is start with what exists and ask ourselves, how does the EAC, for instance, handle the fact that its members have memberships, or rather its members have obligations in other trade rules? And obviously, if it's harmonized at that level, then you create those as the minimum, or rather as the floors, and you build from that. So it's not exactly impossible, but I think the fact that you just have Kenya itself as a member, benefiting from AGOA, the EPAs, we have COMESA and all that, tells you that we actually need one coherent trade arrangement.
So essentially you reduce all this paperwork into just one rule book.
Precisely, so that you just have one consistent way of dealing with trade.
Zemedene, I'm going to come to you. I know you love making the case for Afro-optimism, to essentially believe that things can work, but I'm going to ask you to take the opposite perspective here. What would make the CFTA implode?
What would make the CFTA fail is the lack of political commitment. I think, at the macro level. Now, obviously, not applying the smart technical details, as I said, from trade harmonization, the tax harmonization, and not building sufficient infrastructure for these things, for the goods, in particular for goods to move across Africa, will make it fail. But at the top of the game is, it will fail if the political commitment, the will, is not there. Now, I would like to believe, as you said, I'm always an Afro-optimist. We've gotten this far. I don't think 5 years ago, no one would have expected for Africa to have come this far so quickly. So I'm still very optimistic, but there's still, some work to be done. Remember, the lesson we need to learn from others, and I've spent many years in Latin America when Mercosur was being put together. It took years. So we need to set realistic goals as well, so that people don't lose, don't get discouraged if they don't see the positive upsides in a relative short period of time. We have to tell the politicians and the general public, this thing takes time, but we're getting there, and put the KPIs, the quick wins, so that the public can back these things, because we've seen these kinds of things fail in other parts because the political will fail because the public didn't support it. I think I'm confident in Africa it won't happen, but we still have to guard against that.
Indeed. Gentlemen, you're going to be with me for another part of the program, but essentially that wraps up our conversation on trade in Africa.